In 2023, every 10 minutes, a woman was intentionally killed around the world. Such alarming statistics are not isolated when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago, which continues to grapple with its own scourge of domestic violence, particularly against women. As the world recognizes 16 days of activism leading up to International Human Rights Day when it comes to domestic violence against women, is the world serious and doing sufficient to help its women? We discuss with Roberta Clarke, head of the IACHR, tonight. Roberta Clarke, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Ryan.
Happy to have you on. It was a very critical week when it comes to raising awareness for the elimination of violence against women. How would you assess the current state of women's rights in the Caribbean, and what are the key challenges facing the region when it comes to this domestic violence issue, particularly against women?
Wow, that's a big question. I could write 2 books on this question, Ryan, but let me start off with what is the state of gender equality in the Caribbean. As we know, historically, women and girls have been discriminated against in laws and in culture. And I would say that we still have many signs of discrimination and inequality in our society, but also a lot of signs of progress. So let's start with the progress, because I think it's within the progress that we keep hope alive and we keep our energy and our resolve for the continuation of the struggle for equality. We have many more girls now and women, of course, in education, achieving certification from primary school all the way up to tertiary levels. More women are engaged in the informal employment and also engaged, I suppose, also in the informal economy. More women are involved in decision making, both in the private sector as well as within the government and in parliament. So these are some signs and more women are exercising autonomy and freedom over what they do with their lives. So these are signs of progress. As is another sign of progress is more men than before involved in the care economy, taking care of their children, taking care of their families, breaking the gender stereotypes about what is a man's role and what is a woman's role. So these are some very broad signs of progress, but we have really also very sharp indications that inequality continues to be very much a feature of the life of the Caribbean. And violence against women and girls is one expression of inequality, which we know is a big problem in the region, but also continued women have not attained equality in decision making anywhere, neither in the private sector, neither in the public sector. Just think of the number of women who are involved in the legislature across the region or in the executive branch of government, how many women are ministers across the Caribbean. So we know that it's an unfinished agenda, but certainly on this day, which is one of the days within the 16 days of activism to end all forms of violence against women and girls, we know definitely that the agenda of equality has not been attained yet.
This is where the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights sort of plays a big part. Can you tell us a little bit about the enormity of the work that is required in the Caribbean, particularly when it comes to not only women, but you alluded to a very important sector as well. Teenage girls are increasingly becoming victims of violence.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't say increasingly. I think there's always been a fact pattern about the vulnerability of teenage girls to sexual violence, sexual assault, and planned pregnancies as a result. So I think that also continues to be the case. But from the point of view of the Commission, I would tell you that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an autonomous institution within the Organization of American States with a mandate to promote and protect human rights of everyone. Within the context of the Commission, I am also the rapporteur for women's rights, as well as the rapporteur for the rights of LGBTI persons. And what we receive information regularly from all of the member states of the Organization of American States, which includes all the CARICOM countries, on issues related to the violation of human rights across the whole economic, social, cultural, political, and civil rights. From the point of view of gender equality, we continue to receive information about the prevalence of all forms of violence against women and girls. I want to say, in relation to what we know about the incidents, and I think it's important to have some statistics, within the UN system, UN Women and the UN system did some surveys on the prevalence of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and I think back in 2017. The information is online, but they did the survey in 5 countries: Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago. And that survey found that between 39% of women who have been in intimate partnerships had experienced some form of domestic violence, and it went as high as 55% in one of the countries. So that's really 4 out of every 10 women have experienced some form of intimate partner violence during their lifetime. That's very high. You
That's a
think
really
4 out of
high
every 10
number.
women who have passed you on the street. Very high. And I want to say something about sexual violence. Non-partner sexual violence, that survey also found the statistics go as high as almost a quarter of all women have experienced some form of sexual violence, forced intercourse, unwanted sexual touching. So we know it's a big problem.
That's really alarming statistics that you've just spelled out there, Roberta. And I just wonder, in terms of the policies, legal policies in the Caribbean sphere, particularly when it comes to domestic violence and sexual violence, how would you evaluate the Caribbean's progress or lack thereof?
I would say, in relation to particularly domestic violence, the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago in particular has made a lot of progress in the design of laws. Trinidad and Tobago, where it's on its third iteration of a domestic violence law, and in many Caribbean countries, they're onto their second or third iteration. So when I say iteration, revisions of the domestic violence law to make it more responsive to what we understand to be the experience of women trying to get access to justice. So the law is very good. The issue is not in the law, the issue is in the implementation of the law. So to have an effective law, it has to be implemented. Police have to do that all along the justice chain. Everyone has to act as they're supposed to act. If there's a report of violence, domestic violence, the police have to do their investigation. They should charge if the facts support a charge. They should prosecute. The person may need to have some sort of psychoeducational intervention. The perpetrator, that should be available. The woman should have psychosocial support if she wants. So there's a chain of response, but that all has to be coordinated. And what we are finding in the Caribbean generally, that there are lots of gaps in the delivery or in the implementation of the domestic violence law.
Let's talk a little
So
bit
it's not
about
the
one of
law,
those
it's the
gaps.
implementation of the law.
Let's talk about one of those gaps. Perhaps you've put your finger on the problem when you talk about policing, because that has increasingly come under speculation and the microscope in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly when it comes to domestic violence affairs across the country. One, are our police adequately prepared to deal with such scenarios? Do they know how to go about dealing with such domestic violence reports? And are police a general problem when it comes to the implementation part as you speak of?
I would say that, like Trinidad and Tobago, across the Caribbean, there's been quite a bit of investment in police training. But what we know is that police training without accountability does not necessarily work to the extent that we need it to work. So police training helps police understand what is the framework of the law and what is expected of them. It also, if it's a well-done training, helps them to understand what is their own bias, conscious and unconscious bias that may impede their functioning as police officer. And if the training is also a very good training, it will explain the dynamics of domestic violence. We often find that police are not really prepared to engage in domestic violence because of the stereotypes or myths in their head. And so the training has to really get to the culture around policing. So that's one thing. But then the second part of it is, even though well trained, you have to have some accountability mechanism. So if someone goes to a police station and says, I have been threatened with a knife in my neck, and the police say, well, go and get, as has happened in Trinidad and Tobago, go and get a medical report. The next day, the woman was killed. These are police who don't really understand their duty, but also the person who reported the police that person had nowhere to go, or did not think they had anywhere to go to say, I am not being taken seriously at this police station. Can you please help me? And that's about accountability. So what we are suggesting is that the police response can be improved not only with training, but it also can be improved with accountability so that there's a real-time response when someone goes to a police station to report and does not get the service that keeps them, that protects them and keeps them safe. So both training, culture change, as well as accountability mechanisms.
Still to come in the program, Roberta Clarke addresses domestic violence in rural communities. Part of the work that you do at the IACHR, Roberta, is helping governments across the region, also supporting them in meeting their international obligations when it comes to women's rights and how these roles can be strengthened. I just wonder, what have you seen from Caribbean governments? Have you seen that political willingness and this as a priority from Caribbean governments?
I would say that definitely, if we are to have some sort of I would like to answer that question as objectively as I can, which is what are the indicators of political will? What are the indicators of political will? And I heard recently a wonderful definition of political will, which is the intention and the capacity to achieve a particular result. Isn't that a wonderful definition? Having the intention and the capacity to achieve a result. So what we know is that there is to some extent some political will in relation to the law reform because we have very good legislation in many parts of the Caribbean on domestic violence. Also, in several countries, we have legislation around child protection, also sexual harassment. So we know that the law reform process is going well. But what we don't really have, I think, just yet is a grounded understanding of what we need to do to change the culture. What we know for sure is that all forms of violence against women and girls are expressions of inequality. So we have to get to the root. The root of violence against women and girls is inequality embedded in culture, and we have to get to that. And how do we get to that? Apart from laws and policies, we have to engage in the culture of equality, in our school systems, in our popular culture. Everywhere we have to sort of embed this idea of equal respect and equal dignity. And that, I think, is something that we perhaps in the Caribbean still need to do with much more concerted effort and intention.
On the back of what you just said, Roberta, you make a very interesting point, but I'm sure in your work with the IACHR, you found that different Caribbean countries, perhaps I'm guessing, have different challenges, when it comes to, and may require different recommendations and different interventions when it comes to it. Am I right?
Yes, but because we are we have such great cultural similarities, great historical similarities, and also great legal similarities. We have this legal similarities. We come out of the English common law system, and that has shaped our legal framework. So there's a lot more commonality than there are differences in the region. And so I would say that for the Commission, the message that we have been given in the Caribbean as well as in the Americas is that the state has to develop comprehensive responses. So you have to have responses that are both protective, which is the legal process, but also systems in place which are about prevention, which is your cultural change component. And you also have to have effective responses. Your services have to work. Health services have to work. Justice services have to work. Police have to work. And family services, and they all have to work together in an integrated way. We've also been calling on the states to ensure that they have a due diligent response. So, for example, if someone makes a report at the police station, the police have to have a protocol of a response. We don't leave the response to the discretion of the individual officer. There has to be a very fixed response, and it has to be a known and certain response. And everyone who goes to the police station can expect to get the same treatment so that we can follow. If something has gone wrong, we know exactly where it has gone wrong. So we talk about due diligence in investigation, in the prosecution, if there's need for prosecution, and of course in the punishment. But the punishment also has to have some sort of psychoeducational component so that people who perpetrate domestic violence understand what they're doing and they commit not to reoffend.
Yeah, I'm glad that you sort of touched on how we can improve access to justice for women who have been subjected to violence, be it sexual, be it domestic, be it physical, whatever type of violence. But I do want to specifically zone in on women and girls in rural communities across the Caribbean. There are so many rural communities without perhaps maybe access to internet, communication, or the access is limited.
Yeah.
And that in itself poses challenges for these women to not only report, but to get justice. And so this group of women and girls who are in the Caribbean's most rural communities are susceptible to forms of violence that may go not only underreported, but perhaps not reported, and thus will never get justice. How important is that group of women, Roberta, in when we talk about violence against women?
Yeah, you raise a really excellent point, Ryan. I mean, what we do know is that also the access to justice, access to services, all of that access can be impeded by socioeconomic factors. And as you say, there are those people who live in rural communities, particularly in the larger territories like Guyana and Suriname, really very big geographic spaces, or Jamaica. You are living in a rural community where you may not have a police station close to you, where you don't have a health center close to you, where you may be quite isolated as a victim. And then you may not have the income to travel out of your community to go and seek support. So we know definitely that there's a socioeconomic component that impedes one's pathway to protection and to harm reduction. And so we think when we are talking to member states about what they should do, we have to factor in an understanding of the diversity of women in your country, or people in your country, and the ways in which socioeconomic factors may undermine their ability to get to justice, and which means that the state has therefore to take affirmative measures, act very consciously to make sure that no one, as they say, is left behind. That if you know that people in rural communities lack that access to justice, that you have to put into place some mechanism to get there, including through a very robust social work approach. But that's really a really excellent question. One of the things that we know certainly about why we say domestic violence, in particular sexual violence, are indicators of inequality, because in those surveys where surveys have been done, which interrogate the motive for the perpetration of violence, we often find that there are very high risk factors. And some of those risk factors include controlling behavior. So, in particular, men who want to control women, they limit their access to their friends, they isolate them from their families, they restrict their access to money, even when they're the ones bringing in the money or working, they take the money away, men may take the money away. They're constantly under surveillance, their cell phones are checked. So there's a whole isolation that happens, particularly about women who are experiencing intimate partner violence. And that isolation can be even worse if you are with insufficient income to actually have access to internet and to be able to reach out to get support, or access to transportation to reach out of your community to get support. So yes, it's an excellent question. When we're thinking about a comprehensive protection and prevention response, we also have to understand the diversity of the population, the economic and social diversity of the population, so that we can overcome those barriers.
Coming up next, what more can be done from a policy standpoint to strengthen domestic violence laws? How does the IACHR sort of cater and address the specific needs of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized of women, whether we're talking about Afro-Caribbean women, or whether we're talking about indigenous women, whether we're talking about the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, the first thing that we tell member states, first of all, you have to understand the diversity of your population. And one of the key ways to understand the diversity of your population is to speak to them. So women and girls have to be consulted and have to participate in the decisions which affect their lives. The first thing we say always is nothing for us without us. If you want to understand the reality of anyone's lives, you have to ask them, what is your reality? So the first thing is to create pathways for consultation and for participation in formulating effective laws and policies. So that's one thing. And also to continue to be engaged with communities of women so that you understand what is happening by way of implementation. So we've passed a wonderful law, but what's happening in your community? Are you able to access the courts? Are you able to access the police? We need to have a constant feedback loop. And then we say, to address the causes of violence against women and girls, there's a gender inequality clause, but there's also, in some cases, not all cases, the income insufficiency factor, which undermines the ability to get to safety. So we do need robust social protection. We need access to safe housing, for example, not just safe housing in transition, but safe housing long term, understanding that many women have difficulty, especially if they're responsible for the care of their children and they may have a low income job or maybe no job at all. They're trapped in a situation of violence, that the state has some obligation to help them figure out a way out of that trap. Social protection, access to housing, psychosocial support, for example.
Yeah, part of what you're talking about there, Roberta, is not just government intervention and implementation. It also requires the role of civil society to support such work.
Yes. So yeah, for sure. I mean, the reality is across the Caribbean, women's organizations have been the pioneers in providing services for, in particular, women and children victims of all forms of violence, but in particular, gender-based violence. They often provide those services without any government subvention. So that's also a call that if NGOs are delivering services, that they should be supported to deliver services. I think so that's one recognition, but also because they are delivering services, they're closer to the realities of those who are experiencing abuse. And so therefore they should be part of that decision making, I would say decision making around how to improve the protection and the prevention of violence against women in all its forms.
Surely you must be optimistic in the work you do, despite the alarming figures that you have pointed us to a little bit earlier in our conversation, because women in the Caribbean have been so incredible in their contribution to the region. They've served as our presidents, they've served as our prime ministers, they've served in our schools as teachers. They've been incredible mothers. They've risen to someone like you at an international agency. There are so many shining examples of what women have done and continue to do in the region. I just wonder what is the task ahead to make more women into the great role models that we've seen across the region and eliminate gender-based violence, domestic violence against women, or get that number as low as possible?
Yeah. So another really big question. For us to really end gender-based violence, we have to address the inequality factor. Women demand autonomy over their lives. They demand equal opportunities, whether it's in sports or in the workplace or in education. They demand equal opportunities and they're entitled to equal opportunities, and they demand freedom. And I think that we are getting there, but we're not there yet. And there are other kinds of inequalities that complicate the attainment of gender equality and also quality of life for women and girls. One of the things that we know is that women in particular in the Caribbean have really, I would say, the responsibility of care of children, also the care of the sick, on care of the elderly, and they often do that on really the low income, and they're stressed financially and they're stressed emotionally. Part of getting to equality is also understanding and recognizing the women's care burden, also redistributing that so to make sure men are more involved in the care work, but also that the state has a way of acknowledging that women are doing that care with perhaps social protection approaches. So that's one kind of way that will help women get more time for other kinds of things that they need to do in their lives for freedom, but also to share the burden of care. Important. On the question of violence against women, again, I think it comes down to this. It's a cultural shift that we're needing. I want to say, apart from the cultural shift, so we need a cultural shift that everyone, or the majority of people in society, and particularly men and boys, have to understand that it is their duty to respect women. It's an obligation to respect women. It's an obligation not to perpetrate violence, not to try to control women. And also that they owe it to themselves to be better. All of us owe it to ourselves to be better, but certainly men owe it to themselves not to try to control women and girls. The other thing that's complicating the situation for women and girls is the general increase in all forms of violence in our societies, with the increase in access to firearms and weapons in the region. So we know that that is there's a social fragmentation that's happening, which is connected to the movement of weapons through the Caribbean. And this is something I think we really have to respond to and address.
Roberta Clarke, thank you very much for joining us for what has been a very important conversation during the 16 days of activism for the elimination of violence against women. Really appreciate your time.